You confuse things with intimacy that aren't intimacy. Confuse proximity with closeness. Confuse routine with bond. Confuse information exchange with emotional connection. Confuse time spent with depth created. Confuse familiarity with knowing. Confuse comfort with trust. These confusions aren't stupid, aren't obvious, aren't easy to recognize. They're sophisticated misreadings. They're understandable mistakes. They're common misinterpretations that most men make. Because things that look like intimacy aren't intimacy. Things that feel like connection aren't connection. Things that seem like closeness aren't closeness. Intimacy has counterfeits, has imitations, has false versions that appear real, feel real, seem real, but aren't real. And confusing counterfeit with authentic changes everything about what you think you have, what you believe exists, what you assume is true. You think you have intimacy, you have proximity, think you have connection, you have routine, think you have closeness, you have familiarity. And proximity isn't intimacy, routine isn't connection, familiarity isn't closeness. This distinction matters because men build relationships on false foundations, invest in counterfeit intimacy, commit to imitation connection, and when counterfeit reveals itself as counterfeit, relationship collapses. Not because she changed, because what you thought existed never existed. Not because connection broke, because connection was never there. Not because intimacy died, because intimacy was never alive. What you thought was intimacy was something else, something that looked like intimacy, but wasn't intimacy. Something that felt like intimacy, but lacked essential element that makes intimacy intimacy. Understanding difference between authentic intimacy and counterfeit intimacy is understanding difference between relationship that is real and relationship that is illusion. Most men live in illusion without knowing, believe in connection that doesn't exist, invest in intimacy that isn't intimate. Not because they're deceived by her, because they're deceived by their own misunderstanding of what intimacy is. Intimacy isn't what you think it is, isn't what it appears to be, isn't what it feels like it should be. Intimacy is a specific thing, has specific requirements, operates under specific conditions, and without these specifics what you have isn't intimacy, is something else wearing intimacy's appearance. What most men confuse with intimacy. Long conversations, you talk for hours, share information, exchange stories, discuss topics, spend time talking, and talking feels like connecting, feels like creating intimacy, feels like building closeness. But talking isn't intimacy. Information exchange isn't connection. Conversation duration isn't depth indicator. You can talk for hours and never be intimate, can share endless information and never connect, can have countless conversations and never achieve closeness. Because intimacy isn't about how much you talk, is about what you reveal while talking, isn't about information exchanged, is about vulnerability shared, isn't about duration of conversation, is about depth of exposure. You talk about work, about hobbies, about opinions, about preferences, about daily events, about surface things, about external things, about safe things. And talking about safe things creates familiarity, not intimacy, creates comfort, not connection, creates routine, not bond. Intimacy requires risk, requires exposure, requires revealing what's protected, what's guarded, what's vulnerable. If you're not risking in conversation, you're not creating intimacy. If you're not exposing in dialogue, you're not generating connection. If you're not being vulnerable in exchange, you're not building closeness. Most conversations between people aren't intimate, are familiar, are comfortable, are routine, but aren't intimate. You confuse familiar conversation with intimate conversation, confuse comfortable exchange with vulnerable sharing, confuse routine dialogue with deep connection. And confusion makes you think you have intimacy when you have familiarity, makes you believe you have connection when you have comfort, makes you assume you have closeness when you have routine. Physical proximity, you're together often, you're in same space, you're physically near. You spend time in proximity, and proximity feels like closeness, feels like connection, feels like intimacy. But proximity isn't intimacy. Being near isn't being close. Physical presence isn't emotional connection. You can be in same room and be completely separate, can be physically together and be emotionally distant, can share space and share nothing meaningful. Proximity creates opportunity for intimacy, doesn't create intimacy itself, provides context where intimacy can happen, doesn't guarantee intimacy happens. Most people in proximity aren't intimate, are just near, are just together, are just sharing space. You confuse opportunity with achievement, confuse context with content, confuse being together with being connected. She's there, she's present, she's available, and presence feels like it should mean something, should indicate something, should create something. But presence without vulnerability is just presence. Availability without openness is just availability. Being there without being real is just being there. Intimacy isn't created by proximity, is created by what happens during proximity. Isn't built by presence, is built by what's shared during presence. Shared routines. You have patterns together. You do things regularly. You have established behaviors. You share activities. You have joint routines. And routines feel like bond, feel like connection, feel like intimacy. But routines aren't intimacy. Patterns aren't connection. Shared activities aren't closeness. You can have elaborate routines and no intimacy, can share countless activities and no connection, can have established patterns and no closeness. Routine creates predictability, not intimacy, creates structure, not vulnerability, creates comfort, not depth. You do same things, same ways, same times. You have morning routine, evening routine, weekend routine. You share meals, share activities, share schedule. And sharing schedule creates coordination, not intimacy, creates efficiency, not connection, creates predictability, not closeness. Intimacy requires breaking routine, not establishing routine, requires departing from pattern, not creating pattern, requires going beyond comfortable into uncomfortable. Most couples have elaborate routines and minimal intimacy, have structured schedules and shallow connection, have shared patterns and separate selves. You confuse coordination with connection, confuse routine with relationship, confuse pattern with bond. Physical intimacy, you're sexual, you're physical, you're touching, you share physical experiences. And physical intimacy feels like it should create emotional intimacy, feels like it should generate connection, feels like it should build closeness. But physical intimacy without emotional intimacy is just physical activity. Sexual connection without emotional connection is just sexual activity. Touching without vulnerability is just touching. You can be physically intimate and emotionally distant, can be sexually active and emotionally disconnected, can be touching regularly and never really touching. Physical intimacy can exist without emotional intimacy. Sexual activity can happen without vulnerable connection. Bodies can be close while selves remain distant. Most men confuse physical intimacy with total intimacy, confuse sexual connection with emotional connection, confuse body closeness with self-closeness. You're physical together and assume you're intimate together, are sexual and believe you're connected, touch bodies and think you're touching selves. But touching body isn't touching self. Being sexual isn't being vulnerable. Physical closeness isn't emotional closeness. Intimacy requires emotional exposure, not just physical exposure, requires self-revelation, not just body revelation, requires vulnerability of who you are, not just availability of what you have. Knowing information, you know facts about her, you know her history, you know her preferences, you know her details, you know her information. And knowing information feels like knowing person, feels like understanding her, feels like intimacy. But knowing information isn't knowing person. Knowing facts isn't understanding self. Knowing details isn't intimacy. You can know everything about someone and know nothing about someone. Can have all information and have no understanding. Can know all details and miss entire person. Information is external, self is internal. Facts are surface. Person is depth. Details are visible. Intimacy is invisible. You know where she grew up, where she went to school, what she does for work, what she likes to eat, what she does for fun, what her family is like. And knowing these things makes you familiar with her life. Doesn't make you intimate with herself, makes you informed about her history. Doesn't make you connected to her present, makes you aware of her details. Doesn't make you understanding of her depths. Most men think accumulating information about woman creates intimacy with woman. Think knowing facts generates knowing person. Think details equal depth. You confuse data collection with connection creation. Confuse information gathering with intimacy building. Confuse knowing about with knowing. She told you things. You remember things. You know things. And knowing things feels like it should mean intimacy exists. Should indicate connection is there. Should prove closeness is real. But intimacy isn't proven by information known. Is proven by vulnerability shared. Isn't indicated by facts remembered. Is indicated by depths accessed. Isn't measured by details collected. Is measured by selves revealed. Emotional expression. She shares feelings. She expresses emotions. She tells you when she's happy or sad or frustrated or excited. And emotional expression feels like emotional intimacy, feels like vulnerable sharing, feels like deep connection. But emotional expression isn't emotional intimacy. Sharing feelings isn't sharing self. Expressing emotions isn't exposing depths. You can share surface emotions and never share deep self. Can express reactive feelings and never express core being. Can communicate states and never communicate essence. Happy about promotion, sad about movie, frustrated with traffic, excited about plans. These are surface emotions, reactive feelings, state communications. They're real, they're valid, they're shareable, but they're not intimacy. They're not vulnerability, they're not depth. Intimacy requires sharing emotions that reveal who you are, not just what you're experiencing. Requires expressing feelings that expose your core, not just your reactions. Requires communicating self, not just states. Most emotional sharing between people is state sharing, not self-sharing. Is reaction communication, not essence communication. Is surface expression, not depth exposure. You confuse her telling you she's happy with her, revealing why happiness matters to her existence. Confuse her saying she's sad with her, exposing what sadness means about her being. Confuse emotional expression with emotional intimacy. Time investment. You've been together long time. You've invested months or years. You've spent extended time together. And time investment feels like it should create intimacy. Feels like duration should generate depth. Feels like length should produce closeness. But time doesn't create intimacy. Duration doesn't generate depth. Length doesn't produce closeness. You can spend years together and never be intimate. Can invest decades and never connect deeply. Can have long relationship and have shallow intimacy. Time provides opportunity for intimacy. Doesn't guarantee intimacy. Creates context where depth can develop. Doesn't ensure depth develops. Most long relationships have more accumulated experiences than deep intimacy. Have more shared history than vulnerable connection. Have more time invested than selves revealed. You confuse time spent with depth created. Confuse duration with intimacy. Confuse years together with knowing each other. You've been together 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. And years together feel like they should mean intimacy exists. Should indicate deep connection. Should prove you know each other. But intimacy isn't function of time. Is function of vulnerability. Isn't created by duration. Is created by exposure. Isn't built by years. Is built by depths accessed. Exclusivity, you're exclusive, you're committed, you're only with each other. And exclusivity feels like it should mean intimacy. Feels like commitment should indicate connection. Feels like being only one should prove closeness. But exclusivity isn't intimacy. Commitment isn't connection. Being only one isn't being no one. You can be exclusive and not intimate. Can be committed and not connected. Can be only one and not be deeply known. Exclusivity is agreement, not intimacy. Commitment is decision, not connection. Being only one is status, not depth. Most exclusive relationships have exclusivity without intimacy. Have commitment without deep connection. Have only one status without truly known reality. You confuse her choosing only you with her knowing you deeply. Confuse exclusivity with intimacy. Confuse commitment with connection. You're her only one. And being only one feels significant. Feels like it means something deep. Feels like it proves intimacy exists. But being only sexually doesn't mean being only emotionally. Being only relationally doesn't mean being only vulnerably. Being only in status doesn't mean being only in depth. What intimacy actually is. What distinguishes authentic from counterfeit. What makes real different from imitation. Intimacy is mutual vulnerability, is reciprocal exposure, is shared risk. Vulnerability means revealing what's protected, what's guarded, what could be hurt, what's precious, what's core, what's self. Not revealing surface information. Revealing depth truth, not sharing safe facts. Sharing risky realities, not exposing obvious externals. Exposing hidden internals. Intimacy happens when both people are vulnerable simultaneously, when exposure is mutual, when risk is shared. One person vulnerable while other person protected isn't intimacy, is confession, is disclosure, is one-way exposure. Intimacy requires reciprocity, requires both people revealing simultaneously, requires mutual risk. You can tell her everything and not have intimacy if she tells you nothing vulnerable. Can expose yourself completely and not create connection if she remains protected. Can risk everything and not achieve closeness if she risks nothing. Intimacy is created in mutual vulnerability moment, is built through reciprocal exposure, is achieved when both people are simultaneously unprotected. That moment of mutual vulnerability is intimacy. That experience of reciprocal exposure is connection. That state of shared risk is closeness. And that moment is rare. That experience is uncommon. That state is difficult to achieve. Most relationships have one-way vulnerability, not mutual vulnerability. Have disclosure, not intimacy. Have confession, not connection. You're vulnerable and she's protected. Or she's vulnerable and you're protected. Or both are protected and neither is vulnerable. True intimacy requires both vulnerable simultaneously, requires reciprocal exposure, requires shared risk. This is why intimacy is rare. Why deep connection is uncommon. Why authentic closeness is difficult. Because mutual vulnerability is scary. Reciprocal exposure is risky. Shared risk is threatening. Most people prefer counterfeit intimacy to authentic intimacy because counterfeit is safer, is more comfortable, is less risky. Proximity without vulnerability feels intimate without requiring intimacy. Routine without exposure feels connected without requiring connection. Familiarity without risk feels close without requiring closeness. You confuse safe versions with real thing because safe versions are easier, less scary, less threatening. But safe versions aren't real thing. Easy isn't authentic. Less scary isn't more intimate. You have relationship built on proximity, routine, familiarity, information, time, exclusivity. All these things look like intimacy, feel like intimacy, seem like intimacy. But they're not intimacy. They're intimacy's counterfeits. They're connections' imitations. Their closeness is false versions. And building relationship on counterfeits means building on foundation that isn't solid, on connection that isn't real, on intimacy that isn't intimate. When stress comes, when challenge arrives, when difficulty appears, counterfeit foundation cracks. Proximity doesn't hold under pressure. Routine doesn't sustain under stress. Familiarity doesn't support under challenge. Only authentic intimacy holds. Only mutual vulnerability sustains. Only reciprocal exposure supports. This is why relationships built on counterfeit intimacy fail under pressure. Why connections built on false foundations crack under stress. Why closeness built on imitation collapses under challenge. Not because people are weak, because foundation is false. Not because connection is fragile, because connection isn't real. Not because intimacy is shallow, because intimacy doesn't exist. What you confuse with intimacy isn't intimacy. What you think is connection isn't connection. What you believe is closeness isn't closeness. And building relationship on confusion means building on illusion. Investing in confusion means investing in fantasy. Committing to confusion means committing to something that isn't real. Real intimacy requires real vulnerability. Authentic connection requires authentic exposure. True closeness requires true risk. Most men never achieve this, never create real intimacy, never build authentic connection, never establish true closeness. Not because they don't want to, because they're satisfied with counterfeits. Not because they can't, because they confuse imitation with authentic. Not because they don't try, because they think they already have what they're trying to create. You think long conversations are intimacy. You're satisfied with information exchange. Think physical proximity is closeness. You're comfortable with just being near. Think established routines are bond. You're content with predictable patterns. And being satisfied with counterfeits means never pursuing authentic. Being comfortable with imitation means never creating real. Being content with confusion means never understanding truth. What you confuse with intimacy isn't intimacy, and confusing prevents you from creating what's real, satisfies you with what's false, blinds you to difference between authentic and counterfeit, until pressure reveals truth, until challenge exposes foundation, until difficulty shows what's actually there. And what's actually there isn't what you thought was there, isn't what you believed existed, isn't what you assumed was real. What you thought was intimacy was proximity. What you believed was connection was routine. What you assumed was closeness was familiarity. And proximity without vulnerability isn't intimacy. Routine without exposure isn't connection. Familiarity without risk isn't closeness.